If you learned to drive in Britain in the 60s, you might remember the Hillman Imp, the plucky little runabout with its engine in the back, the car built to take on the Mini. It was made in a brand new factory at Linwood, in the west of Scotland, a great modern plant, opened by royalty, thousands of jobs, a whole town built around its gates. And Linwood endured. It survived a brutal start and years of strife, and a car the world was slow to trust. It survived 2 decades of being told that Scotland could not build motorcars, and in the end it proved them wrong. And then, after 18 years, the gates closed, the machines stopped, and the great plant fell silent for good. How does a factory that had finally learned its craft simply vanish? What happened to the little car that should have won? Chapter 1. The Man Who Sold Everything. The story begins, as so many British motor stories do, not on a factory floor, but behind a shop counter, with a young man who could sell you a car you hadn't come in for, at a price you hadn't planned to pay, and leave you thanking him for it. His name was William Roots, though everyone who knew him called him Billy. He was born in 1894 in the Kent village of Goudhurst, where his father ran a bicycle repair shop built on £75 of carefully saved capital. That was the whole of the family fortune. A workbench, a set of tools, and a father who understood that things which move, bicycles, then motor cars, were the future, and that the men who sold them would do rather better than the men who mended them. Billy learned the mending first. At 15, he was sent north to Coventry and apprenticed to Singer, one of the great names of the early British motor trade. Coventry in 1909 was the beating heart of it all, a city that had made ribbons and watches and bicycles, and was now turning, street by street, workshop by workshop, to the automobile. The boy from Kent spent his days among lathes and engine blocks, learning how a car was actually put together. It was an education that would matter more than anyone could have known, because Billy Roots was never going to be an engineer. He was going to be a salesman, and the salesman who knows exactly how the thing is built is the most dangerous salesman of all. By 19, he was back in Kent, running a branch of the family business. Then came the First World War, and after it, a decision. Billy had a younger brother, Reginald, born in 1896, quieter, sharper, with a ledger, trained as an accountant in the Admiralty. Where Billy was all charm and forward motion, Reggie was all caution and arithmetic. Their father handed each of them £1,200 and, in effect, told them to go and build something. They did, and decades later, Billy would describe the partnership in a single line that captured everything. "I am the engine," he said. "Reggie is the steering and brakes. One brother to push the enterprise forward at reckless speed. One brother to keep it on the road." It was a division of temperament that ran right down to the bone. Billy could charm a bird out of a tree and then, so the saying went, sell the tree back to it. He was the swaggering, ferociously ambitious frontman who understood that selling a motor car was really about selling a feeling. Reggie was the accountant, quiet and precise, the man of careful sums who trusted a ledger more than a handshake. On their own, each might have made a decent living. Together, they were something else entirely, a machine for building an industrial empire out of almost nothing. This is the story of what those two brothers built. A motor empire that stretched across the Midlands and out to 140 countries, that armoured Britain through its darkest war and helped rebuild a city from ashes. And it is the story of the single decision, made far from any boardroom they controlled, that would bring it all down. Not through failure of nerve, not through want of talent, but through a car that was never allowed to be built in the place it should have been built, and a factory 300 miles from home. Chapter 2. A shop in Kent. The Roots brothers did not start by making cars. They started by selling other people's, and they were extraordinarily good at it. From that first branch in Kent, they expanded outward with a speed that bewildered their competitors. By the early 1920s, they had secured the Austin franchise for London and the surrounding counties, and opened showrooms in the centre of the capital. Then, more franchises, more branches, spreading through the southeast and reaching into the industrial Midlands. In 1926, they took over Devonshire House in Piccadilly and made it their headquarters, a statement address for two men who, a decade earlier, had been fixing punctures in a Kent village. The genius of it was distribution. In an age when most motor firms simply built cars and hoped someone would buy them, the Roots brothers understood that the money and the power lay in controlling how those cars reached the customer. They built the largest motor distribution business in Britain. They knew what people wanted before the manufacturers did, because they were the ones standing in the showrooms, watching buyers walk past this model and linger over that one. And what they increasingly believed was that the manufacturers were getting it wrong, building the wrong cars, missing what the public actually desired. It gave them a peculiar kind of power. A firm that sells more of your cars than anyone else is not a customer you can ignore, and the Roots brothers were not shy about using their leverage. They knew which colours sold and which sat unwanted on the forecourt. They knew what a family would pay and what made them bulk. They had turned the act of selling cars into an intelligence operation, and everything that operation told them pointed to the same conclusion. The men who built Britain's cars did not understand the people who bought them nearly as well as two former bicycle mechanics from Kent did. By 1928, there was only one logical next step. If you're convinced the makers don't understand their own market, and you already control the route to that market, then you stop selling other men's cars and start selling your own. But building a motor company from scratch is a slow and ruinous business. So the brothers did what they had always done. They bought. With the financial backing of Prudential Assurance, a detail that mattered enormously because it gave two former car dealers the capital of one of the country's great institutions, they began acquiring the famous ailing names of the British motor trade. Hillman first, then Humber, then Commer, the commercial vehicle maker. In the space of a few short years, a distribution business turned itself into a manufacturer by absorbing the very firms whose cars it had been selling. What they found when they opened the doors sobered them. Hillman and Humber and the rest were revered names, but many of them were running on outdated equipment and antiquated methods, the industrial equivalent of a grand old house with the roof falling in. Some were losing money hand over fist. Turning them around was a monumental task, and it demanded exactly the sort of unglamorous, remorseless work that Billy Roots had neither the patience nor the temperament for. This was where Reggie earned his keep. While Billy charmed the dealers and dazzled the press, Reginald went into the factories with his accountant's eye and his quiet sums, tearing out the old ways, imposing order, standardizing parts across the different marks so that a component made for one car might serve in another. He worked out what could be saved and what had to go. It was cold work, and it made enemies, but it was the reason the group survived its own ambition. Every empire that grows by acquisition risks collapsing under the weight of what it has swallowed. Reggie was the reason Roots digested its conquests instead of choking on them. And in 1932, the brothers had their first real proof that the gamble was working. It was a car called the Hillman Minx, an 1185cc saloon, unremarkable to look at, priced for the ordinary family, and built to be sold in enormous numbers. It became Roots's first genuine global success. The Minx would go on to be the backbone of the whole enterprise for the next 30 years, a name that meant reliable, sensible, affordable motoring in every market Roots could reach. The acquisitions kept coming. In 1935, the brothers took control of the Anglo-French firm of Sunbeam Talbot Darracq, bringing two more historic marques and a whiff of sporting glamour into the fold. Then Carrier, the commercial vehicle builder from Huddersfield. Later, Singer, the very company where Billy had served his apprenticeship as a boy. He had come back to own the place that taught him. By 1938, with war clouds gathering over Europe, the Roots Group was turning out 50,000 vehicles a year and shipping tens of thousands of them overseas as knockdown kits to be assembled in markets from Australia to South Africa. Two brothers, one bicycle shop, £75 of starting capital, and now one of the largest motor concerns in the country. The engine and the brakes had built something remarkable. They were about to build something far larger, because the war that was coming would transform the Roots Group from a motor company into an arm of the state, and would give Billy Roots a role in the survival of Britain itself. Chapter 3. The Coventry Colossus. When war came in 1939, Billy Roots did not wait to be asked. He put himself and his entire organisation at the disposal of the government, and the government, recognising a formidable industrial talent when it saw one, put him to work at the very centre of the war effort. He was made a key figure in the Shadow Factory scheme, the vast secret programme to build aircraft and armaments in enormous new plants deliberately scattered away from the traditional industrial centres that German bombers would target. Roots was among the very first firms into the scheme, and the brothers threw themselves at it with the same energy they'd brought to the motor trade. Reggie was given charge of production for the Ministry of Supply, applying the same quantity manufacturing discipline he'd imposed on the car plants to the assembly of aero engines and airframes, and earning himself a knighthood for it. A shadow plant went up at Stoke-Aldermore in Coventry to turn out aero engines, and it was under this scheme in 1940 that Roots built the plant that would become the beating heart of the entire group for the next half-century. A massive assembly works at Ryton-on-Dunsmore on the outskirts of Coventry. Here is the quiet irony that sits at the root of the whole story. The great shadow factories were deliberately planted where the bombers couldn't easily reach and where labour could be found, the government of the day steering industry across the map for reasons of national survival. Roots accepted that logic in wartime without complaint, because in wartime, the logic was sound. 20 years later, a government would steer a Roots factory across the map again for reasons of its own, and that time the logic would prove fatal. Ryton did not build cars at first, it built weapons of war. Bristol Blenheim bombers rolled out of its doors, and later the great Handley Page Halifax, one of the heavy bombers that carried the war back to Germany. The scale of what Roots achieved in those years is difficult to overstate. By the end of the conflict, the company had built roughly 1 in every 7 bombers produced in the United Kingdom, 60% of the nation's armoured cars, 30% of its scout cars. A firm that a dozen years earlier had been fixing up ailing saloon car makers was now one of the great arsenals of a nation fighting for its life. And then, on the night of the 14th of November 1940, the war came to Coventry itself. The Luftwaffe came in waves that lasted 11 hours. They dropped some 35,000 incendiary bombs, 50 landmines, and around 1,400 high-explosive bombs on a single city in a single night. The medieval cathedral burned to a shell. Whole streets simply ceased to exist. It was one of the most concentrated acts of destruction visited on any British city in the entire war, and it gutted the very heart of the motor trade that Billy Roots had grown up in. When the sun came up over the ruins, Billy Roots was among those who refused to be broken by it. He threw himself into the reconstruction of the shattered city with the same head-on energy he brought to everything, organising, cajoling, driving the recovery forward. It was said of him that he met this challenge as he met all others, directly and at speed. For his wartime service, both to production and to Coventry, he was knighted in 1942. In 1959 he would go further still, elevated to the peerage as Lord Roots. The boy from the bicycle shop had become a baron. When peace returned, the brothers moved fast to convert their wartime muscle into commercial dominance. From 1946, they concentrated their light vehicle production at Ryton, the great shadow factory now turning out family cars instead of bombers. And in 1948 came a wave of new models that announced the arrival of what would become the group's true golden age, a new Phase 3 Hillman Minx, a handsome Humber Hawk, styled by the American design legend Raymond Loewy, and the elegant Sunbeam Talbot 80 and 90. These were good years, confident years. Britain in the years after the war was desperate for dollars and foreign currency, and the government made a hard bargain with its car makers. You may have steel, but only if you export. The export drive at Roots was ferocious. By the early 1950s, more than 70% of everything built at Ryton was being sent abroad, comfortably clearing the 50% target Whitehall had set, and then some. Roots cars went to the far corners of the old empire and beyond. The Hillman name meant something in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, in India. Many went out not as finished cars at all, but as flat-packed kits, crated up and shipped halfway round the world, to be bolted together in local plants by local hands. A Coventry car with a foreign birth certificate. And there was glamour to go with the bread-and-butter saloons. Sunbeam were building genuine sporting machines, cars that would go rallying across the mountains of Europe and come home with trophies. It was the perfect Roots formula, really. The sensible Minx to pay the wages, the dashing Sunbeam to turn the heads, and Reggie's careful sums underneath it all, making sure the glamour never outran the arithmetic. By the middle of the 1950s, the Roots Group stood as one of the pillars of the British motor industry, Britain's own answer to General Motors, sitting alongside the giants of Ford, Vauxhall, and the British Motor Corporation. Two brothers controlled a family of famous marquees, a great manufacturing complex around Coventry, and a distribution empire that reached across the world. They had built the Colossus. Now they had to decide what came next. And the answer to that question, the ambition that would define the final act of the Roots story, was already taking shape in the minds of two young engineers who had noticed a gap in the range, a hole where a small car ought to be. Chapter 4. Where the Cars Were Born. To understand what Roots was at its height, you have to stand inside Ryton in the years when it was working at full stretch, and to understand that, you have to arrive the way a worker arrived. You'd come in off the Coventry road in the grey of a Midlands morning, part of a river of men flowing through the gates, thousands of them, on foot and on bicycles, and in the cars they'd built themselves. Ryton had been designed on a wartime scale, and even turning out family saloons it kept that vastness. Long, low assembly halls under a sky of corrugated roofing, the space swallowing the noise of thousands of voices until you crossed the threshold and the noise swallowed you. Inside, the sound never stopped. It was the baseline hum of a great works in motion, the clatter and thump of the presses stamping body panels out of flat-sheet steel, the hiss of airlines, the whine of drills, the ring of metal on metal down the length of the line. A man who spent 30 years at Ryton could tell you, decades later, exactly what that sound was like, because it was the sound of his working life. You didn't hear it after a while. You'd have heard it if it ever stopped. It began in the press shop, and the press shop was a kind of controlled violence. Great presses came down with a force you felt through the soles of your boots, stamping flat sheets of steel into doorskins and wings and roof panels in a single crashing stroke, one every few seconds, all day. The men who fed them learned to move to a rhythm that never varied and never forgave a wandering hand. Out the far side came the raw shapes of a car, stacked and trolleyed away to be joined. The line itself was the miracle. This was the discipline Reginald Roots had spent his life perfecting, the moving assembly line that turned a bare steel shell at one end of the hall into a finished, gleaming, drivable motorcar at the other. The body came first, spot-welded together in a storm of sparks by men wearing leather aprons scorched brown with use, then dipped and primed and sprayed and baked until the paint came up deep and even, and the smell of cellulose hung so thick in the paint shop that it got into your clothes and rode home with you on the bus. Then the body moved, always moving, never still, down through the stations where the men waited, each with his task, each with his few feet of the car and his allotted span of minutes. Here, a team dropped in the engine and gearbox. There, a man fitted the wiring loom, threading it through the body like veins. Further down, the glass went in, the seats, the trim, the chrome. The men who did this were skilled, and they knew it. Fitting a door so the gaps ran true, and it shut with a solid, satisfying sound, was not a job any labourer could do. It took a feel for the work, an eye and a hand that came only with years. There was real pride on that floor, the quiet, unshowy pride of men who could look at a finished minx rolling off the end of the line and know their hands were in it, and there was a whole world built to keep the line moving. Ryton had its own toolmakers, the aristocrats of the shop floor, men who had served long apprenticeships and could cut a die or true a jig to 1,000th of an inch, and whose word on a matter of engineering was not to be argued with. It had its own upholstery section, women bent over sewing machines, stitching seat facings and door trims. It had its own inspectors, walking the line with clipboards, running a thumb along a panel gap, rejecting what wasn't right and sending it back with a chalk mark and a hard look. At the very end came the men who drove each finished car off the line and put it through its paces, listening for the rattle or the misfire that meant the thing wasn't fit to carry a family. The canteen fed the shifts in relays, the smell of frying and strong tea drifting across the floor at the break, a warm human counterpoint to the tang of cellulose and hot metal and machine oil that hung over everything and never quite lifted. The rhythm of the place ran on the shift. The works hooter marked the day the way a church bell marks a village. The start, the breaks, the blessed sound of the end. Men clocked in and clocked out, and the cards in the rack told the story of who was there and who was late. And on Friday came the wage packet, that small brown envelope of folded notes and coins, the whole point of the week, the thing that paid the rent and fed the children and, for a great many families around Coventry, built an entire way of life. Because that was what Ryton really produced. Not just cars. It produced the wages that bought the houses in Ryton-on-Dunsmore and the surrounding villages, that filled the pubs on a Friday night, that sent Coventry's children to school in decent shoes. A man could leave school at 15, walk through those gates and know he had a trade for life. His father might already be on the line. His son might follow him onto it. The works and the community that grew around it were not two things. They were one thing, breathing together to the rhythm of the shift. That was the golden age on the floor. But the true measure of what Roots had become could only be seen from higher up, from the reach of the name, the span of the empire, the sheer dominance of a group whose cars ran on roads the brothers would never see. Chapter 5. A name the world knew. Step back from the assembly line, and the scale of what the Roots brothers had assembled comes properly into view. This was not one factory. It was an empire of them, and an empire of names. Under the Roots umbrella sat Hillman, the bread-and-butter mark of the sensible family saloon. Humber, the dignified, upholstered car of the bank manager and the mayor, the marquee that carried Field Marshal Montgomery through the Desert War in a specially built staff car. Sunbeam, the sporting name, building rakish roadsters that went rallying across the Alps. Singer, the mark that had once taught Billy Roots his trade. Commer and carrier for the lorries and vans that did the heavy work of the country. From the cheapest runabout to the stateliest saloon, from a delivery van to a competition car, the group had something to sell you at every rung of the ladder. Each mark had its own character, its own customer, its own idea of what a car was for. A Humber was bought by a man who had arrived, a solicitor, a doctor, a town councillor, and it was built to reassure, rather than to excite, all walnut and leather and unhurried dignity. A Hillman was for everyone else, the school teacher, the shopkeeper, the young family stretching to their first new car. A Sunbeam was for the man who still had a little devil in him. That was the true cleverness of the empire the brothers had assembled. Whoever you were, whatever stage of life you'd reached, there was a Roots car waiting to sell you the version of yourself you wanted to be. And when your circumstances changed, the same dealer would happily sell you the next one up, and it sold them everywhere. The export operation that had powered Roots since before the war reached, at its height, into something like 140 countries. In an age when a British car was a common sight on the roads of Africa, Asia, Australasia, and the Americas, Roots was one of the great engines of that trade, shipping complete cars and, just as often, crates of parts to be bolted together in local assembly plants half a world away. A Hillman Minx put together in New Zealand, a Humber shrugging off the dust and heat of an Indian summer, a Commer van working the streets of a South African town. The name stamped on the badge was a Coventry name, and it meant something on roads the men who built it would never see. The distribution genius that had launched the brothers in the first place never left them. Roots didn't just build cars, it controlled, through the vast dealer and servicing network it had spent decades assembling, the whole journey of the car from factory gate to family driveway and beyond, the showroom that sold it, the workshop that serviced it, the counter that sold the spare part, the man who sold you your next one when the time came. Every one of those touches was another chance to keep a customer inside the family for life. It was a machine for turning steel into loyalty, and for 30 years it worked beautifully. A boy might be driven home from the maternity hospital in his father's Minx, learn to drive in a Hillman, court his wife in a Sunbeam and grow old in a Humber, and every one of those cars would come from the same showroom, serviced by the same mechanics, sold by the same firm. There was glory too, of the kind that money can't quite buy. Sunbeam took the fight to the continent on the great road rallies, and a young Scottish driver by the name of Sterling Moss made his early competition reputation at the wheel of a Sunbeam Tilbert. In time, the sporting flame would burn brighter still, with the Sunbeam Alpine and the thunderous American-engined Sunbeam Tiger, a car so quick it drew a certain fictional secret agent's attention on the screen. These were the halo cars, the ones that put a little stardust on the sober family saloons and made a Roots badge something a young man might actually dream about. And presiding over all of it, the two brothers, still the engine and the brakes. Billy, Lord Roots now, the public face, the showman, the man the newspapers loved, the industrialist who dined with ministers and could talk export figures with a cabinet as easily as he could sell a car to a farmer. Reggie in the background, the sums always running behind his careful eyes. The hand on the brake that had kept the whole hurtling enterprise on the road for 3 decades. But an empire built on famous old names carried a hidden weakness, and in the affluent, fast-changing Britain of the late 1950s, it was beginning to show. Roots made medium cars and large cars and sporting cars and lorries. What Roots did not make, what Roots had never made, was a genuinely small car, a cheap car, a first car. And in the Britain that was emerging, more and more of the people walking into those showrooms wanted exactly that. The dealers were saying it, loudly, up the chain to Coventry. Give us something small to sell. Give us something to put in front of the young couple, the second car family, the buyer with more sense than money. Every month that Roots had nothing to offer them was a month those buyers walked out and bought elsewhere. There was a hole in the range, right at the bottom, and through it the future was quietly draining away. The brothers knew it, and out of that knowledge came the most ambitious, most modern, and ultimately most fateful project the Roots Group would ever undertake. The car that was meant to secure the empire's future, and would instead help end it. Chapter 6. The car that wasn't there. The problem had a date, and the date was 1955. That was the year Roots formally set out to build a small car, to plug the gap at the bottom of the range before it swallowed them. The reasoning was simple and, on paper, unarguable. The 1-litre class was a huge and growing slice of the British market, and Roots had precisely no presence in it. Then, in 1956, came the Suez Crisis. Petrol rationing returned to Britain's forecourts, and overnight the case for a small, thrifty, economical car went from strong to overwhelming. The nation was suddenly, acutely interested in cars that sipped fuel rather than gulped it. Roots had nothing to offer, but this would not be a cheap, tinny, cut-price runabout. The brothers didn't have it in them to build something shoddy. What Roots set out to make was a small car that was better than a small car had any right to be. Sophisticated, clever, advanced. They handed the job to 2 young engineers, given an almost free hand. Mike Parks, a gifted man who would later go on to race in Formula 1 for Ferrari, and Tim Fry, still in his 20s. The 2 of them set about designing something genuinely new. The early attempts were not pretty. One utilitarian prototype was known, with brutal honesty, as the Slug. The story runs that Lord Roots took one look at it and hated the sight of it so thoroughly that he refused even to ride in the thing. The old salesman's instinct was intact. Whatever this car was going to be, it could not look cheap. So the project was reborn under a new name, Apex, and driven to maturity by the group's technical director, Peter Ware. And what emerged from Apex was, by the standards of a small British car in the early 1960s, close to astonishing. Roots had no small engine of its own, so they turned to a neighbour, the racing engine specialist's Coventry Climax, and adapted a lightweight all-aluminium unit that had begun life, of all things, as a fire pump motor. 875 cubic centimetres of alloy, mounted at the rear and canted over at 45 degrees. It made the Imp the first British mass-produced car, with both its engine block and its cylinder head cast in aluminium. A technical leap that put it, in that one respect, years ahead of the competition. And it didn't stop there. The car had fully independent suspension on all 4 wheels, its geometry worked out after the engineers spent time studying an American Chevrolet Corvair. It had a beautifully engineered transaxle gearbox with full synchromesh, smoother to shift than the very rival it was chasing. It had a rear window that opened, so you could load parcels straight onto the folded-down back seat. Clever, light, nimble, quick. Those who drove it early said it handled better than a Mini. It might have been the star. It should have been the star. There was only one difficulty, and in 1955 it had looked like a strength. Right at the start, the team had settled on a rear-engined layout, the configuration of the mighty Volkswagen Beetle, then riding high across the world. And even in September 1959, when the British Motor Corporation launched a small car that turned the entire industry on its head. A car with its engine at the front, driving the front wheels, packaging 4 adults into a box barely 10 feet long. Roots looked at their rear-engine design, already years into development, and decided to press on. The Mini was here. It had beaten them to the market by nearly 4 years. But Roots had committed, and Roots carried on. This is the summit. This is the highest point Roots would ever stand on. A great motor empire, 3 decades in the building, one of the pillars of British industry, backed by the Prudential, led by a lord and now armed with the most advanced small car the country had produced, a genuine rival to the Mini, ready to reclaim the ground the group had been losing. Everything the brothers had built pointed forward to this moment. They had the car, they had the engineers, they had the will, the capital, and the reputation. All they needed now was somewhere to build it. A new factory, close to Ryton and Coventry, where the parts were made and the skilled men lived, and the whole intricate machine of car building had been humming for a generation. It was the obvious place, the only sensible place. Roots acquired the land there and applied for permission to build, and the government said no. Chapter 7. The Gathering in Whitehall. The government said no, and to understand why that single word did so much damage, you have to understand what was happening far from Coventry, in 2 places at once, in a design studio at Longbridge and in the corridors of Whitehall. At Longbridge, the British Motor Corporation had already changed everything. In August 1959, they had launched a car designed by a brilliant Cust engineer named Alec Isagonis, and the Mini rewrote the rules of the small car overnight. Isagonis had turned the engine sideways and driven the front wheels, and in doing so, he had packaged 4 adults into a box barely 10 feet long, with almost every inch given over to the people inside. It was a stroke of genius, and it was already selling. The Imp, still years from production, was now chasing a car that had redefined what the whole class could be. Roots had been beaten to the punch by nearly 4 years, and the punch had landed hard. There was a bitter irony buried in that head start. Roots had begun thinking seriously about a small car back in 1955, before the Mini was even a sketch. The fuel panic of the Suez Crisis in 1956 had only sharpened a plan that already existed. Roots had seen the future coming. They had simply been too slow and too ambitious, and too determined to make something clever to get there first. While Isagonis drove his revolution to market with ruthless speed, Roots polished and refined and agonized, and the years slipped away, and the gap that a small car was meant to fill was filled by somebody else. Worse, the Imp was chasing the Mini in the wrong direction. Roots had settled on a rear engine, back when that still looked like the future, the layout of the conquering Volkswagen Beetle. But fashion in engineering can turn as cruelly as fashion in anything else, and by the early 1960s the rear-engined small car was already beginning to look like yesterday's idea, just as the Mini's front-wheel drive layout became the template the entire industry would copy for the next 50 years. A rear engine hangs its weight behind the back wheels, and a car built that way wants to swap ends in a corner if you get it wrong. The Imp's engineers had spent enormous effort taming that tendency, studying an American Chevrolet Corvair to get the suspension right. They had largely succeeded, but they had poured that brilliance into solving a problem the Mini had simply sidestepped by putting the engine at the front. Peter Ware, the technical director who had driven the Imp to maturity, would say it plainly in later years. The decision to build a rear-engined car had been a misjudgment. It had always been a gamble, and it was a gamble that failed. But the gamble on the engineering might have been survivable. The gamble that killed the Imp was made not by engineers at all. It was made by politicians, and it was made, in its way, for the best of reasons. Britain in 1960 had a map with a wound down the middle of it. In the prosperous South and the industrial Midlands, there was work and money and confidence. But in the old industrial heartlands, the shipbuilding rivers, the coalfields, the mill towns, the post-war world was turning cold. On Clydeside, the great yards that had built a third of the world's ships were shedding men. In Renfrewshire, in Paisley and Greenock and the towns around them, unemployment was becoming a permanent condition rather than a passing misfortune. A government that did nothing about that map would answer for it at the ballot box, and Harold Macmillan's government had no intention of doing nothing, and it was not merely a matter of votes. The west of Scotland was living through the slow death of the thing that had defined it for a century. The Clyde had been one of the workshops of the world. Clyde built was a mark of quality on ships from every ocean, and now the orders were drying up, the slips going quiet, the sons of shipwrights leaving school into a world that no longer needed the trade their fathers had mastered. Whole communities were watching their reason for existing ebb away, and many of their young people were doing what Scots had done in hard times for 200 years, packing up and leaving, for England, for Canada, for anywhere with work. To a government facing that, the motor industry looked like salvation, a modern, growing trade that could take the skilled hands the yards were shedding and give them a future. The impulse behind Linwood was not cynicism. It was something much more dangerous. Hope. Their instrument was a slip of paper called an Industrial Development Certificate. Under the powers the government took in 1960, no firm could build a large new factory anywhere it liked. It needed a certificate from the Board of Trade first, and the Board of Trade could simply refuse. If a company wanted to expand in a place that was already rich in work, the answer could be no. And the unspoken second half of that, no was an offer. Refuse a firm permission to grow in the Midlands, and you could steer it, instead, to the places that needed the jobs. As one account of the thinking of the day put it, a company might be told, in effect, that the government would build it a new factory, somewhere else instead. Roots was not the only company caught in this machinery, and that matters, because it tells you the policy was a considered plan and not a piece of spite. Across the industry, the same hand was steering. Ford was pushed to build on Merseyside, at Halewood. Vauxhall went to Ellesmere Port on the same estuary. Standard Triumph was sent to Speke, also on Merseyside. And in Scotland, two great new plants were to rise where the shipyards and the coal had been, the British Motor Corporation to Bathgate in West Lothian, and Roots to Linwood in the west. The government was quite deliberately taking the British motor industry, which had grown up clustered around the Midlands for 100 good reasons, and scattering it across the map to wherever the unemployment was worst. The intention was noble. The engineering logic was ignored. The man most associated with bringing car-making to Scotland was John Macleay, Lord Murchiel, the Secretary of State for Scotland, who saw in the motor industry a way to put the west of Scotland back to work, and the arithmetic was seductive. In parliamentary debate in 1960, ministers spoke of two great new plants that would rise together north of the border. A British Motor Corporation works at Bathgate, and a Roots works at Linwood. Between them, it was said, they would employ 8,000 or 9,000 Scots. Linwood alone was projected at around 3,500 jobs. 3,500 jobs was the seed of the whole tragedy. A political figure, not an industrial one. It was far more than Roots needed, far more than the Imp could ever justify. A number chosen to satisfy a map and a manifesto rather than a production line. The government wasn't asking Roots where it made sense to build a car. It was telling Roots where it made sense to create Scottish jobs and expecting a car to be built there as the price of admission. Roots had wanted to grow at home. They had gone so far as to acquire land next to Ryton, in the heart of the Midlands, where the parts were made and the skilled men lived, and the whole intricate machine of car building had hummed for a generation. They applied for permission, and the answer came back from Whitehall, again and again. No, not there. Somewhere else. 300 miles away, in a corner of Scotland that had built magnificent ships and had never, in all its history, built a car. Chapter 8. 300 miles from home. So Roots did the only thing a company can do when the state holds the permits. They agreed. They took the offer, the loans that came with it, and the site 300 miles north, a greenfield in Renfrewshire, beside an existing body-pressing plant, where their new car works would rise from farmland. And in doing so, they made the decision from which every other disaster of the Hillman Imp would flow. The men who agreed to it were not fools, and the trap was real. The alternative to Linwood was not build it at Ryton after all. The alternative was build it nowhere. No certificate, no expansion, no new small car, and the gap at the bottom of the range left wide open for the Mini to pour through. Faced with a factory in the wrong place or no factory at all, Roots chose the factory. Under the pressure of the moment, it was almost the only choice available. That is what makes it a tragedy rather than a blunder. The decision was forced, and it was reasonable, and it was ruinous, all at the same time. There were even sweeteners that made the poison easier to swallow. The government offered loans to build the plant, and the plant that rose at Linwood was, by the standards of the day, genuinely modern, including an advanced die-casting facility built specially to produce the Imp's clever aluminium engine on site. A brand new factory, part funded by the state, kitted out with the latest equipment, in a region crying out for the work. Set down on paper, in a ministry in London, it must have looked like everyone winning at once. The company got its factory. Scotland got its jobs. The Imp got its home. Nobody in that room was thinking about the 300 miles of railway line between the new home and everything the car actually needed. The new plant went up with enormous fanfare. It was opened in May 1963 by the Duke of Edinburgh himself, a royal blessing on a great national project, new work for a proud region, a modern car for a modern Britain. There were speeches and photographs and a sense of a corner being turned. On paper, it was a showpiece. On the ground, it was 300 miles from everything the car needed. The launch of the car itself was staged with the same confidence. There had been months of advance publicity, the motoring press primed, the showrooms readied. This was to be the car that answered the Mini at last, the sophisticated small Hillman that would win back the ground Roots had been losing. And for a moment, the promise held. The reviews admired the engine, the handling, the cleverness of it all. Then the cars reached the customers, and the gap between the promise and the product opened up, and it never closed again. There is a particular cruelty in a launch that goes well, followed by an ownership that goes badly. It means the disappointment is measured against a hope the company itself created, because here is what the map in Whitehall could not see. Roots had spent 30 years building a dense web of suppliers, machine shops and skilled trades in and around Coventry. That web could not be picked up and carried to Scotland. It stayed where it was. And so the making of a single Hillman Imp turned into a journey of almost comic and finally tragic absurdity. Follow one engine. It begins as molten aluminium at Linwood, poured in that gleaming new die-casting plant the government had helped pay for, cast into a block and cooled. So far, so modern. But Linwood could cast the block and it could not properly machine it. The fine work of boring and finishing an engine to the tolerances a motor demands belonged to the skilled men and the specialist equipment 300 miles south. So the raw block was crated, loaded onto a railway wagon, and sent down the length of the country to Wrighton, near Coventry. There it was machined by the men who knew how, and then it was crated again, loaded again, and sent all the way back north to Linwood, to be dropped at last into the car it had been cast a few hundred yards from months before. 600 miles. For every engine, in every car. A journey built into the cost of the thing, mile after mile, wagon after wagon, year after year. A tax on distance that no rival building its cars in one place ever had to pay. BMC built the Mini, where its parts were made. Roots shipped the heart of the Imp, the length of Britain and back before it ever turned a wheel. Every delay on that line, every wagon held in a siding, every winter that closed the tracks, was a delay in Scotland measured in the whole width of the country. It was, in the plainest sense, no way to build a car, and it was the direct, unavoidable consequence of building the car where the jobs were instead of where the making was, and the men who were to build the cars had never built a car. This was no criticism of them. They were skilled and proud, and their fathers and grandfathers had built some of the finest ships ever to leave a British slipway. But a ship and a motor car are not the same craft. A ship is built heavy to survive the sea. The tolerances are measured in the strength of a weld you could stand on. A car is built light and fine and to the fraction of a millimetre, and it is built the same way 10,000 times over, to a rhythm that never lets up. The men of Paisley and Greenock came from the yards and the mills with the wrong muscle memory for the work, through no fault of their own, and there was no local tradition to catch them when they stumbled. Think about what that greenfield really meant. At Wrighton, a raw apprentice was surrounded by men who had spent their lives on the line, and he learned the craft by standing next to it. 1,000 small corrections passed down without a word being spoken. At Linwood, there was nobody to stand next to. The whole workforce was raw at once. The men on the line were learning the line. The charge hands were learning to run it. Even the managers, many of them sent up from the south, were learning a workforce and a place they didn't know. Everyone was new on the same morning. And a car factory where everyone is learning at once does not produce a gentle learning curve. It produces cars that carry every lesson in their panels. So, the fit and finish suffered. Panels that didn't quite meet. Doors that didn't quite shut with that solid, reassuring sound. Water that found its way in where it shouldn't. The small, damning imperfections that a buyer notices the moment the salesman hands over the keys and remembers for the life of the car and mentions to everyone he knows. And then, on top of the wrong place and the wrong hands, came the wrong timing, the last of the fatal decisions. The Imp was late, by the time it launched, in the same month of May 1963 that the Duke cut the ribbon at Linwood. It was already running years behind where it should have been, and the Mini had a head start it would never surrender. Under that pressure, Roots did what desperate companies do. They pushed the car into production before it was truly ready. It was a genuinely clever, sophisticated, ambitious design, and every clever thing about it was a new thing that could go wrong. The all-aluminium engine was a first for a mass-produced British car, light and eager, and years ahead of its rivals, and unforgiving of poor casting and careless servicing in a way an old cast-iron lump never was. It ran hot, and its cooling system demanded attention that inexperienced owners and mechanics didn't always know to give it. There was an ingenious pneumatic throttle that used a diaphragm rather than a simple cable, advanced, elegant, and troublesome enough that it would later be replaced with a conventional linkage. There was an automatic choke that misbehaved. Clever idea stacked on clever idea, thrown onto a brand new line, in a brand new factory, in the hands of a brand new workforce, before any of it had had the time to settle. The result was written into the cars, and it was written in public. They overheated, they leaked, head gaskets failed, and each fault, on its own, was the sort of thing a determined engineering team could have chased down and cured in a year of steady development, the sort of teething trouble almost every new car suffers in private, before launch. The Imp suffered its teething troubles afterwards, in the driveways of the first customers, in the letters pages and the workshops and the gossip of the saloon bar. And they did the one thing a new car can least afford. They gave the Imp a reputation. A reputation, once earned, is very hard to lose, and this one would cling to the car for all 13 years of its life. Think of what that meant for the dealers, the very men who had begged Coventry for a small car in the first place. Roots had one of the finest dealer networks in the country, 30 years in the building, a machine for turning steel into loyalty. Now that machine was working in reverse. The salesman who had sold a family their Imp on Saturday was seeing them back in his workshop on Wednesday, and again the week after, watching the trust he'd spent a career building drain away over a leaking gasket and a door that wouldn't shut. Every warranty claim was a small betrayal of a customer who had believed the Roots name meant what it had always meant. The empire had been built on people coming back. Now, they were coming back for all the wrong reasons. And then, in the end, not coming back at all. Everything that would destroy the car was now in place. Not one mistake, in truth, but one mistake that forced all the others. A single decision about a location, made in Whitehall for the soundest of reasons, that poisoned the water at the source. Chapter 9. The Cost of Distance. The trouble began almost at once, and it began on the factory floor. The 1960s were a period of deep industrial unrest across British manufacturing, and Linwood got the worst of it. A new workforce, a new plant, a management 300 miles from head office, and a car that kept going wrong. It was a recipe for conflict, and conflict came. There was a gulf at Linwood that no amount of goodwill could quite close. The men on the floor were West of Scotland tradesmen, with the fierce collective memory of the shipyards behind them. A culture where the union was not a nuisance, but a shield, hard-won and jealously guarded. The managers were, in many cases, Coventry men sent north to run a plant in a place whose rhythms they didn't share. Neither side was villainous, but they were strangers to one another, and strangers under pressure fall out. In 1964 alone, Linwood suffered 31 separate stoppages. 31. Strikes, walkouts, work to rule. Each one halted the line. Each one starved the plant of parts or left finished cars waiting for a component that hadn't arrived on the train from the south. The absurd logistics that had looked like a line on a map now bit hard. When a part was late in Coventry, it was late by 300 miles in Scotland. A stoppage anywhere in the chain rippled the length of it. The plant that was meant to run like a modern showpiece spent much of its time waiting, and the cars that did get built weren't selling as they were meant to. The plant had been designed to build in vast numbers. The political arithmetic had demanded a factory big enough for 150,000 cars a year. It never came close. It managed perhaps a third of that in a good year. A factory built for a flood, trickling. Roots tried everything to make the Imp pay. They dressed it up and sold it under other names. A plusher version wearing the Singer badge as the Chamois, sportier ones as the Sunbeam Imp and the racy little Stiletto, a van for the tradesman, an estate called the Husky. It was the old Roots trick, the one that had built the empire. Take one good car and spin it into a whole family of them, one for every customer. But you cannot badge your way out of a reputation. Whatever name was on the bonnet, the car underneath was the one the public had already decided not to trust, built in the plant that couldn't stop stopping. And the damage did not stay contained to one model. This was the deepest cruelty of the Imp's failure. It did not fail quietly, in a corner, while the rest of the group prospered. It failed at the very heart of the enterprise, and its failure spread outward through everything Roots was. The cash it consumed was cash that could not be spent developing the next Minx, the next Humber, the next Sunbeam. The reputation it damaged was the Roots reputation, the one that had taken 30 years and 3 generations of loyal customers to build. A whole empire of good and profitable cars found itself dragged down by the one car that had been meant to secure its future. The Imp did not merely fail. It took the strength of the group down with it, model by model, year by year. The money began to run out. Every faulty Imp that came back under warranty cost Roots money to put right. Every lost sale was a sale the Mini took instead. A company that had been one of the pillars of British industry found itself burning through cash it could not replace, year after year, with no small car success to show for it. The Imp had been meant to secure the group's future. Instead, it was quietly consuming it. And then, in the middle of it all, the engine stopped. On the 12th of December 1964, Lord Roots died. He was 70, and cancer took him. Billy Roots, the boy from the bicycle shop, the salesman who could charm a bird from a tree, the man who had built the whole empire out of charm and nerve, was gone at the precise moment the empire needed his nerve most. His son, Geoffrey, took the chair. But there are men whose absence changes the weather in a company, and Billy Roots was one of them. He had been the salesman who could talk a wavering minister round, the showman who could make the city believe, the sheer force of personality that had held a sprawling empire to its course for 40 years. With him gone, the enterprise drifted. The engine of the enterprise had died. Reggie, the steering and brakes, was in his late 60s now and would retire within 3 years. The 2 brothers who had turned £75 into a motor empire were leaving the stage together, just as the stage began to collapse. The numbers told the story without any need for adjectives. In the year to the summer of 1966, the Roots Group lost £10.7 million. For a company already undercapitalised, already stretched, already bleeding from the Imp, a loss on that scale was not a wound. It was a diagnosis. There was only one way to keep the gates open, and it came from across the Atlantic. The American giant Chrysler had been circling for a while. It wanted a European arm of its own, to stand against Ford and General Motors, who already had their British operations, and a wounded Roots, rich in famous names and dealer networks but starved of cash, was exactly the opportunity it needed. Chrysler took its first stake in 1964. It did not pounce, it seeped. The stake deepened year by year as the losses mounted and the family's position weakened, each fresh injection of American money buying another slice of a British institution. It was less a takeover than a slow tide coming in. In 1967, the tide reached the top. The Roots family sold control. The great British empire the brothers had built became a subsidiary of an American corporation, run increasingly to American priorities, and in time stripped of the very name that had meant something on roads around the world. The famous old badges, Hillman, Humber, Sunbeam, Singer, were living on borrowed time now, and one by one they would be retired. That same year, Sir Reginald Roots retired as chairman, at 70. The last of the 2 brothers stepped down, and with him went the last living link to the bicycle shop in Kent. What the brothers had spent a lifetime building now answered to Detroit, and the Imp, the car all of this had been for, simply carried on, quietly, unloved, never selling in the numbers it needed. The great engineering effort of the mid-1960s went not into the small car that had cost the group its independence, but into keeping the whole business alive. Under Chrysler, the money and attention flowed towards other models, and the Imp was left to soldier on with only minor changes. A clever design frozen in time while the world moved past it. It limped through the rest of the decade and into the next, a car that had been born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and never recovered from either. When production finally ended in March 1976, after 13 years, just over 440,000 had been built. The car Roots had staked its future on had sold, across its entire lifetime, roughly what the plant had been designed to build in 3 years. The Mini, the rival that had beaten it to the market by 4 years, would go on to sell more than 5 million and stay in production into the 21st century. Two small British cars launched within 4 years of each other, both clever, both loved by those who understood them. One became a national icon that outlived the century. The other became a cautionary tale. The difference between them was never really the engineering. It was where they were allowed to be built. The Imp was gone. But Linwood, the factory that should never have been where it was, would take a little longer to die. And it would take a town with it. Chapter 10. The Silence in Renfrewshire. When the Imp ended in 1976, Linwood did not close. It soldiered on, building other cars for its new American masters, the Avenger, and later a small hatchback called the Chrysler Sunbeam. The great plant that had been forced into existence to build one car outlived that car, and for a few more years it kept the wages flowing into the terraced streets of Renfrewshire. Then the ownership changed again. In 1978, Chrysler sold its struggling European operations to the French, to Peugeot, who revived the old Talbot name and hung it on the cars coming out of Linwood. A factory that a British government had planted in Scotland to build a British car was now a French-owned plant, 3 owners removed from the brothers who'd been sent there against their will. The end came on the 11th of February, 1981. The Talbot Motor Company announced that Linwood would close. In the House of Commons that day, ministers spoke of their regret, and Scottish members spoke of devastation, and everyone in the chamber understood that a promise made in 1960 had finally run out. The figures were merciless. Talbot's share of a shrinking British market had slipped from 8% to 6%, and Linwood's ageing models, the old Avenger, the Sunbeam, accounted for a mere 2% of the cars sold in Britain. To bring the plant up to date would have cost well over £100 million, perhaps 200. Its French parent was in trouble at home and shedding tens of thousands of jobs across the world. A loss-making factory at the far northern end of the country, needing a fortune to modernise, was never going to survive that arithmetic. The men in Paris did the sums the men in Whitehall had never done, and the sums said no. And by the end, Linwood had finally learned to build cars. In its last full year, there were no strikes at all. Productivity had risen by nearly a quarter. The workforce that had once been mocked as shipbuilders who couldn't make a motor car had become, after 20 hard years, exactly the workforce the plant had always needed: skilled, settled, and proud of the work. It closed anyway. That is the part that sits worst. Not that a troubled factory failed, but that it was shut at the very moment it had come good. That 2 decades of learning, of strife and slow improvement, of fathers teaching sons the craft the town had never had, ended not in triumph, but in a padlock. Around 4,800 people lost their jobs the day Linwood died, and in a town that the factory had all but created, that number was not a statistic. It was the town. When Linwood went, the reason for a great many people to be in Linwood went with it. The buildings came down soon after, hauled away in pieces, until by the mid-1990s, the last of the great plant was gone, and there was nothing left to show that Britain had ever tried to build a car here at all. In Parliament, a Scottish Labour member named Bruce Millen looked back on the whole story and gave it its epitaph. Critics, he noted, had said Linwood was doomed from the start, and he agreed with them. The fault, he believed, lay in that original decision of 1960, the mistaken choice to put a car factory where no car factory belonged. Today, the land where the Imp was born is a retail park. There is a supermarket open around the clock, a cinema, the usual bright ranks of fast food signs and car parks. Families push trolleys across tarmac laid over the ground where the die-casting plant once poured aluminium and the line once rolled. It is busy, it is useful, and it carries no trace of the 10,000 hopes that a government once planted here. Chapter 11. What remains? There is a song, written a few years after Linwood closed, by 2 brothers from Leith. It is a lament for the industrial Scotland that was disappearing in those years, and it does something very simple and very devastating. It names the lost places, one after another, Linwood among them, and turns a list of closed factories into something a whole country could sing. That is what happened to the name. It stopped being a car plant and became a word in a song about loss. The Hillman Imp deserved better than it got. That is the quiet truth at the centre of it. It was a genuinely clever car. Light, quick, advanced, better to drive than the Mini in the eyes of many who drove both. In another life, built in Coventry among the men and the suppliers who knew how, launched when it was ready rather than when the calendar demanded, it might have been remembered as the car that fought the Mini to a standstill. The engineering was never the thing that killed it. It is tempting to blame a single mistake, but the truth is subtler and sadder. It was one mistake that made all the others inevitable. A single decision, taken in Whitehall for reasons that were genuinely decent, to put a factory where the jobs were needed rather than where the car could be built. Everything else flowed downhill from there. The 600-mile engines, the learning workforce, the rushed launch, the reputation, the strikes, the losses, the American takeover. Pull the thread back through all of it, and it ends in one office, with one refusal and one map with a wound down the middle of it. The government of 1960 was not wicked. It was trying to answer a real and painful problem, a corner of Scotland where the ships had stopped coming and the work had drained away. It reached for the motor industry as a lifeline, and it meant well, and it was wrong. Good intentions built Linwood. Good intentions cast those engines in the wrong place and sent them on their long, doomed journeys south and back. The road to that empty retail park was paved with them. Reggie and Billy Roots had turned £75 into an empire that spanned the world. They did it by understanding, better than anyone, what people wanted and how to get it to them. And in the end, the thing they could not overcome was not a rival, or a recession, or a failure of their own imagination. It was a line on a map, drawn by others, that they were never allowed to cross. Stand in that car park in Renfrewshire on a grey afternoon, and there is nothing to hear. No presses, no hooter, no river of men through the gates in the morning. Just the traffic on the A737, and the trolleys, and the wind coming off the Black Cart water the way it did long before anyone thought to build cars here. The ships were built on the Clyde because the Clyde was the right place to build ships. The Imp was built at Linwood because Linwood was the right place to need a job. Between those two facts lies the whole of the tragedy, and everything that was lost in the distance between them.